Brannick Yorrell had no friends, no family, and no online footprint. But he knew everything about Callen Briar. When the 8-year-old vanished from his quiet Georgia neighborhood, no one suspected the soft-spoken trash worker with a history of disappearing. Jobs. Yet beneath Brannick's silence was a monstrous obsession, transforming innocence into waste, burying secrets where no one dared look, until the boy's body surfaced in a landfill and a terrifying game began. 11-year-old Callen Briar lived with his single mother, Talia, in the peaceful town of Dovewood, Georgia. It was a quiet place, where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other's names, and children walked to school without fear. Callen was known as a kind, polite boy who loved comic books, video games, and collecting small, colorful stones he found on his way to school. He had a routine that rarely changed. Every day, he left his house at 7:30 a.m., passed through Maple Avenue, stopped briefly at the corner store for a snack or soda, then continued to Dovewood Elementary school. That routine had been the same for 3 years, and no one had ever thought twice about it, until the day he didn't come home. It was Thursday, and the weather was clear. Talia expected Callen home by 3:15 p.m. When he didn't walk through the door by 3:45, she assumed he had stayed behind for something at school, maybe a book fair or a last-minute class project. By 4:30, she started calling his friends' parents. No one had seen him. By 5 a.m., panic took over. Talia drove to the school herself, her heart pounding. The campus was empty. She spoke to the front desk clerk, who confirmed Callen had been marked present that morning, but had left with the rest of the children at dismissal time. That was the last time anyone saw him. At 6:20 p.m., Talia contacted the police. Within the hour, an official missing child alert was issued. Officers searched the nearby streets, the school grounds, the surrounding woods, and the small river running through the edge of town. Volunteers from the neighborhood joined the search, carrying flashlights and calling out his name into the trees. They checked abandoned buildings and culverts. The corner store clerk confirmed that Callen had come in that afternoon, just like always, bought a chocolate bar and left in the direction of home. But then, nothing. No one saw him after that. No camera footage from homes or businesses captured him walking by. It was as if Callen had disappeared into thin air between the store and his front porch, a distance of just 3 blocks. The next morning, news spread quickly. Local reporters gathered in front of the Briar house. The town mayor made a public statement, urging the community to stay calm and remain vigilant. Social media pages were flooded with Callen's photo, a smiling boy with sandy brown hair and bright blue eyes, wearing a green hoodie and jeans. Dovewood Elementary closed for a day as police officers interviewed teachers, classmates, and staff. Drones flew over the woods and rivers. Search dogs were brought in. But there was no sign of struggle, no discarded backpack, no piece of clothing, no sound heard by neighbors. It was like a ghost had taken him. People whispered theories in the grocery store aisles. Some believed he had been taken by someone from outside town. Others thought it had to be someone local, someone who knew his route and routine. Talia stayed inside, overcome with guilt and grief, convinced she had missed some warning sign. Meanwhile, the police followed every lead they could. A few teenagers were questioned. A suspicious van was pulled over. A local man with a history of mental illness was interrogated, but all of it led nowhere. 1 week passed, then 2. Flyers aged in the sun. Candlelight vigils were held at the park. Local businesses donated to a reward fund for information. But the silence grew heavier. By the 3rd week, many in the town quietly feared the worst. Though no one said it aloud, people began to believe Callen was no longer alive. The search efforts slowed. Media attention faded. Hope dimmed. And then, one early morning, as the police prepared to close several dead-end leads, a brown envelope appeared on the police department's doorstep. It was unmarked, sealed with clear tape. Inside it was a single photograph, a blurry Polaroid of a landfill with barbed wire fencing in the background. On the back were 4 chilling words, scribbled in black ink. "Look beneath the wire." It was the first real clue they had, and it would take the case into even darker places. The brown envelope marked a sudden shift in the investigation. After weeks of dead ends, the photograph of the landfill brought urgency back to the case. Detectives studied the Polaroid carefully. It showed a wide, grim expanse of garbage mounds behind a chain-link fence lined with coils of barbed wire. Despite the poor image quality, they were able to identify the location. It was Stonecroft Waste Facility, just outside of town, a place where much of Dovewood's trash ended up. It was a sprawling, unpleasant site with steep heaps of compacted garbage, always buzzing with machines, trucks, and scavenger birds. No one had considered it part of the search area before. That same afternoon, authorities mobilized a search team and headed to the landfill. A large section of the site was temporarily closed off. Officers, forensic specialists, and volunteers, wearing protective gear, arrived with excavators and metal detectors. The stench of rot and industrial waste filled the air. They began searching near the northeast quadrant, where the barbed wire from the photograph matched a specific fenced-off drop site. Hours passed as crews dug carefully, moving trash in controlled layers, wary of disturbing potential evidence. They used long poles and hooked tools to sift through broken furniture, old clothes, decomposing food, and plastic waste. Forensics experts scanned for fibers, biological traces, or anything unusual. Nothing stood out, until a German shepherd, with the canine unit, suddenly stopped near a slope of garbage, tail stiff, barking repeatedly. The dog's handler signaled to the team, and they started digging deeper in that exact spot. What they uncovered was a black trash bag, tightly bound with layers of electrical wire. Unlike the common household garbage around it, this bag was tightly wrapped and deliberately buried beneath other debris. The team cautiously opened it. Inside was the small, lifeless body of Callen Briar. He was badly decomposed, but still identifiable by the clothing he had been wearing the day he disappeared. His green hoodie, now soiled and torn, and his blue jeans. The scene turned solemn. Officers stepped away in silence, some visibly shaken. Forensic photographers documented everything. Medical examiners took the body into custody, while officers cordoned off the area. The search had ended, but the real investigation had only just begun. Callen had not run away. He had not been lost. He had been murdered and discarded like refuse. An autopsy was scheduled immediately. Early findings showed ligature marks on his wrists and ankles, suggesting he had been restrained. Bruising around his mouth indicated he had been gagged. There were no signs of sexual assault, but the cause of death was still pending further analysis. It was now a homicide case, and detectives had a new urgency. The Polaroid, the location, the method of disposal. It all pointed to a killer who was both organized and calculating. Questions swirled. Who had sent the photograph? Was it the killer taunting the police? Or someone who had stumbled upon the truth and was too afraid to speak openly? The image had no fingerprints, no DNA, no traceable materials. The paper and ink were common. Surveillance. Footage from the outside of the police department revealed nothing useful. The envelope had been left during a blind spot in the camera's rotation. The media descended again. Headlines screamed about the tragic discovery, about the horror of a child's body found in a landfill. Talia Briar collapsed when she was told and had to be hospitalized for dehydration and trauma. The town's grief turned to rage. Parents looked at each other with suspicion. Rumors circulated quickly. Some blamed strangers, others whispered about local employees at the landfill. But the police urged patience. They now had a crime scene, a body, and a disturbing delivery of a clue. Back at the police station, investigators began comparing the method of disposal with other cases in neighboring states. They started pulling missing child reports from the last 5 years. A few had eerie similarities. But one lead quickly came into focus. Someone had a history of working with trash, someone with access, someone who had knowledge of the facility and its operations. That someone had been flying under the radar and buried beneath the public eye. The truth was about to begin surfacing, one twisted clue at a time. Following the grim discovery at Stonecroft Waste Facility, the investigation turned toward anyone connected to the landfill. Police combed through employee records, delivery logs, and security clearance documents. Nothing immediately stood out until someone mentioned the local school's art teacher, Rhett Solance, who was known for collecting trash and discarded materials for his unusual sculptures. Rhett often roamed nearby dumpsters and waste drop-off sites, including Stonecroft, looking for items to use in his artwork. His obsession with garbage and his solitary lifestyle began to raise quiet alarm bells within the task force. Rhett Solance was a peculiar man in his late 40s. He lived in a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Dovewood. Students often whispered that his house smelled like glue and rotting wood, and his classroom was filled with strange mannequins, twisted metal forms, and dolls without faces. To outsiders, he was simply eccentric. But in light of Callen's murder, eccentricity started to look a lot more suspicious. The police obtained a warrant to search his home. Inside, they found a maze of grotesque sculptures, towering figures made of trash, wood, cloth, and wire. Many were vaguely humanoid, others had exaggerated limbs, or heads made from mannequin parts. But one sculpture, placed directly in the center of Rhett's living room, chilled investigators to the bone. It was the figure of a small child, arms bound with electrical wire, mouth sealed with cloth, dressed in tattered children's clothing. On closer inspection, officers realized the outfit on the sculpture closely resembled the one Callen had been wearing when he went missing. Though the clothing turned out to be a duplicate, not Callen's actual clothes, it was enough to trigger alarm. Investigators dug deeper. They examined Rhett's computers and sketchbooks. The computer was old, but still operational. His search history was full of references to obscure art, dark photography, and historical images of restraint and decay, nothing explicitly illegal but deeply disturbing. One folder contained digital photos of his sculptures, including multiple ones of children bound, gagged, and placed in trash bags as part of performance pieces. Rhett claimed it was all metaphorical, commentary on society's treatment of the ETI vulnerable. But in the basement of his house, police found something far more troubling. A hidden crawl space behind an old furnace led to a small, dimly lit storage room. In it were cardboard boxes labeled by year. Each box contained dozens of photographs, many taken with an old Polaroid camera. Most were of artwork, but a few were candid photos, some of children at the school, captured from strange angles. Callen was in several. In one, he was leaving the corner store. In another, he was climbing the jungle gym alone at recess. These were not school event photos. They were stalker images. And Callen wasn't the only child. Investigators identified at least 5 other kids, none of them from Dovewood. After checking databases, they confirmed a disturbing connection. 2 of the children in the photos were from states where missing child reports had been filed within the last 3 years. Rhett was arrested that evening, charged with obstruction and suspicion of involvement in Callen's murder. His home was sealed off, and media swarmed the area. Parents demanded to know how a man like him had passed background checks and been allowed to work so closely with children for years. The school district suspended him immediately, but the investigation took a sharp turn just days later when forensic tests on Callen's clothing and the trash bag came back. The DNA found on the electrical wire and inside the bag did not match. Rhett Solance. None of his fingerprints, skin cells, or hair were present. The rope fibers were different from those found in his home. The camera that took the Polaroid also didn't match Rhett's. And critically, timestamps on his location history placed him at an art supply store during the exact window when Callen was believed to have been killed. Suddenly, the pieces didn't fit. Rhett may have been disturbed. He may have had an unhealthy obsession with dark themes and young subjects. But there was no concrete evidence linking him to the murder. Detectives were forced to face an unsettling reality. Either Rhett was a master manipulator, or someone else had carefully crafted a scene to implicate him. Someone who knew his odd habits, someone who could easily shift blame. And that meant the true killer was still out there, watching, waiting. And possibly closer than anyone imagined. With Rhett Solence cleared as the primary suspect, the investigation was thrown into chaos. Public trust faltered. The townspeople of Dovewood, who had briefly found closure in Rhett's arrest, now returned to a state of fear and confusion. The idea that someone could carefully frame a man, using his odd lifestyle and disturbing hobbies against him, suggested the real killer was intelligent, calculating, and familiar with the inner workings of the town. It wasn't just a random crime. It was someone who understood how to manipulate both perception and evidence. The forensic team continued reviewing every shred of material found with Callen's body. One lead finally began to emerge. The trash bag used to wrap his remains contained trace fibers of synthetic insulation, the kind often found inside high-performance work gloves. A microscopic fragment of a red label was also found, stamped with partial letters that matched a brand known for industrial gear, Chlormax Safety Supplies. The brand wasn't sold locally in Dovewood, but one of the regional distribution centers was located just 30 minutes away in Haversville. Investigators pulled employee records from Chlormax. Among the names was one that instantly caught attention. Brannick Urell, a former waste transporter who had briefly worked part-time at Stonecroft Waste Facility. His employment history revealed a pattern: short stints at different sanitation companies, never staying longer than 6 months. He had been fired from multiple jobs due to erratic behavior, but no formal criminal record. His address placed him in a run-down camper parked behind an abandoned auto body shop at the edge of Haversville. He had no immediate family listed. He lived alone. When police arrived at the location, Brannick was gone. But inside his camper, they found a chilling collection of items. Stacks of old newspapers detailing missing children cases were taped to the walls. There were Polaroid cameras, dozens of used film packets, and a small burner phone that had been wiped clean. In one drawer, they discovered a spiral-bound notebook. Most pages were covered in erratic, nearly illegible writing, but a few were drawings of trash bags, children's faces, and dark tunnels. On the final page, written in large black ink, were the words, "Truth is buried deeper than trash." Behind the camper, officers uncovered a buried metal toolbox. Inside were zip, ties, duct tape, stained gloves, and a broken keychain with a plastic tag. The tag bore the name Callen in faded marker. The evidence was mounting, and the task force was confident that Brannick Urell had been involved, if not directly responsible, for Callen's death. An interstate manhunt was launched. Brannick's image was circulated across law enforcement channels. Gas station and toll booth cameras showed his last known direction of travel, heading north on Route 62 in a stolen gray sedan. Alerts were issued in 4 states, but Brannick was slippery, skilled in avoiding detection. He had no credit cards, no social media, and seemingly no personal connections. While the manhunt intensified, investigators began connecting Brannick to other unsolved disappearances. In 3 cases, the pattern was disturbingly similar. A child vanished. A community searched. Nothing was found until weeks later when a body appeared in a remote or discarded location. Each case had small traces of Brannick's behavior: plastic binding, synthetic gloves, handwritten phrases. But this time, he had made a mistake. He had left behind a photograph and a trail, perhaps intentionally. One theory among investigators began to grow: that Brannick had become obsessed not only with the act of killing, but with the spectacle of the investigation. He wanted the police to follow him. He wanted the fear. The photograph wasn't just a clue, it was a performance. He had picked Rhett Solence not by accident, but because Rhett's bizarre lifestyle made him an ideal scapegoat. Brannick wanted to inject chaos into a grieving community. He wanted to be the unseen hand pulling every thread. As the days passed and Brannick remained missing, a terrible realization set in. This wasn't over. If he had killed before, he could kill again. He had left just enough evidence to keep authorities chasing him, but never enough to catch him outright. The case was spiraling into something larger, more intricate, and far darker than anyone in Dovewood had imagined. And somewhere out there, the man who murdered Callen Briar was still moving, silently through towns, watching, waiting for the next name to scratch into his notebook. Weeks turned into months, and Brannick Urell remained at large. Despite a national bulletin, interviews with former employers, and surveillance footage from every toll booth and rest stop along Route 62, he had vanished without a trace. The FBI joined the investigation, designating him a fugitive and classifying the case as part of a potential serial offender profile. Yet, no new leads surfaced. He had become a ghost, one who left behind the chilling echo of Callen Briar's murder and the deeply staged misdirection that followed. While the public feared he might strike again, investigators shifted their focus to understanding the man they were chasing. Behavioral analysts reviewed the case files, physical evidence, and psychological markers, concluding that Brannick was likely driven by a need to control narratives. His actions, deliberate misdirection, the taunting photograph, the buried body, were less about hiding and more about creating chaos. His obsession with trash, decay, and forgotten places wasn't just a theme, it was a philosophy. Brannick didn't just dispose of his victims. He tried to erase their value, reduce them to garbage in society's eyes. The key to understanding him, they believed, was in the notebook found in his camper. Though most pages were incoherent ramblings, a pattern emerged. He referenced the buried truth repeatedly and wrote obsessively about replacements and discarded souls. Analysts suspected this referred not just to his victims, but to his own fractured identity. He saw himself as discarded, forgotten, an outcast, and by targeting children like Callen, he sought to impose that same fate on others, reenacting his own emotional abandonment in the most literal, horrifying way. One of the most disturbing revelations came from a re-examination of missing child reports from across 5 states. A timeline of disappearances suggested Brannick had possibly been active for nearly a decade, always choosing isolated towns, always striking when search efforts seemed disorganized or uncoordinated. But what set Callen's case apart was the deliberate clue left behind. That photo wasn't just an accident, it was a turning point. A shift in Brannick's behavior. For the first time, he had inserted himself into the narrative not just as a silent predator, but as a shadow puppeteer. Then, unexpectedly, a breakthrough came. A janitor at a truck stop in Tennessee reported a suspicious item left behind in a restroom, an envelope. Inside were 2 Polaroid photographs. One was a snapshot of a playground at dusk, empty, with a slide and swings barely visible under a fading sky. The second was more alarming. It showed a child's shoe partially buried in gravel, next to a rusted chain. Written on the back in messy black ink were the words, "Not yet finished." Forensic teams rushed to the truck stop. DNA lifted from the envelope matched Brannick Urell. The shoe in the photo was later identified as belonging to 9-year-old Ellis Corman, a boy who had disappeared 2 towns over just days before. Investigators scoured the playground from the photograph and found the burial site within 20 feet of where the image had been taken. Ellis was found alive, bound, dehydrated, but breathing. He had been hidden in a wooden box beneath a pile of leaves and garbage bags. The boy was immediately hospitalized, and his family was notified. The discovery was both miraculous and deeply unnerving. It meant Brannick was not only still active, but he was evolving. He hadn't killed Ellis. He had used him to extend the game, to show the police that he controlled the pace. He could take, and he could return. It also proved he was watching. Their every move, feeding off the reaction. The media exploded. For the first time, a victim had survived, and the public believed justice was close. But Brannick had disappeared again. Despite every resource now dedicated to hunting him down, he was always one step ahead. His motives remained unclear, his background still partly unknown. What was certain was that he wasn't finished. Not with the investigators, not with the public, and possibly not with the town of Dovewood. In memory of Callen Briar, the town erected a monument near his school. Small handprints etched in stone, surrounded by forget-me-nots. But the presence of that statue stood not just for remembrance. It stood as a warning. Because while the town healed and tried to move on, the name Brannick Urell remained etched in their nightmares. He had turned their grief into a story, one that wasn't over, and somewhere, beyond the reach of cameras and roadblocks, the man who called himself forgotten was still watching, still waiting, and still deciding who to erase next.